drive them, I guess, to Madagascar. We have some students from the seminary. He's an author of books and articles, a couple of them handling the Word of God, the Word of Truth, Law and Gospel in the Church Today, and a small catechism on human life. I think he'll share at least a little bit maybe of that. He's also, I talked yesterday about publishing a new book this coming fall. So, he's a member of, I think you still are, the LCMS Committee on the Sanctity of Life.
Right.
Okay. And last November, he was honored by the Concordia Historical Society, or Institute, I guess, for his work in William Wade in terms of his involvement in the Missouri Synod. And so we appreciate you being with us this morning, and we would like to welcome you.
Good to be with you today. We finished up classes at Fort Wayne about 2 weeks ago, and I've been away from Fort Wayne for most of that time. But good to be at Toledo today. Pastor Gorman, former student, his the recall period has ended, so I can't take him back. It's always good to be in a congregation served by former students. What I thought I would do today, in our time together, is basically try to cover 3 interconnected topics, all having to do with ethics, and with application, I think also, as the title of publicity indicated, ethics in everyday life, because ethics is not simply finally kind of a theoretical undertaking. It has to do with the way that we live life in this world, as we live in the presence of God through faith in Jesus Christ, and in the presence of one another, the neighbor, through love. So what I thought I would do today is kind of divide the presentation into basically 3 sections. The first section is going to deal with, as I put it up here, testing postmodern assumptions. In other words, we hear a lot today about postmodernity. What does that actually mean? How has it changed the way that we think about ethics? And just work with that topic here for the first hour or so, and then we'll take a little break, and in the time before lunch, kind of an overview of a particularly Lutheran way of approaching the topic of ethics. And then finally, this afternoon, zero in on one specific item, and that would be ethics at the end of life. We hear a lot, of course, about that today, not only with Vermont just a couple of weeks ago becoming another state to legalize physician-assisted suicide, but very practical questions that individuals and families sometimes have to make when they are confronted with a loved one who appears to be approaching death, and the question of whether to continue treatment, under what conditions to continue treatment, or whether to cease and desist. Yeah, how do we make those decisions in such a way that honors the word and will of God, and on the one hand does not try to play God and deciding when death is going to occur, or doing something that becomes causative of death, but on the other hand not holding on to physical life as though biological or physical existence were the only or the highest good. So we'll look at that as kind of a practical application piece, I think, after lunch. I have passed around, or I think or it's being passed around, just a short bibliography here of some books and articles that I might refer to today, and things that might be of interest in terms of further reading. We'll also want to include time for you to ask questions. I hesitate a little to say questions and answers. I can guarantee, or you can guarantee the questions. I'm not necessarily going to promise to guarantee answers to all the questions, but at least we can have some discussion as we go along here today. So let's dig right in then to this topic of testing postmodern assumptions. When we talk about postmodernism, we are confronted with something that is sometimes kind of hard to define. A number of years ago, there was a Supreme Court justice who was asked for his definition of pornography. Remember that one? He said, well, I don't know how to define it, but I can tell you when I see it. And in a similar way, I think that's how it goes with postmodernity. It's a term that a lot of people are using, and using in a lot of different ways, and it's not necessarily that easy to kind of nail it down and have a definition that is unassailable. It's a word, in fact, that has a variegated history over the last 50 years. The term itself first emerged in the area of architecture, so that it was used as a way of describing a new form of architecture. So-called postmodern architecture tended to be eclectic, combining elements of old and new, but in a way that there was often kind of a contrast and even conflict between these variegated elements of structure. Well, that had nothing, I won't say it had nothing to do with the way we talk about postmodernity today, but the term itself was originally a term that came out of the arena of architecture, and then it was also used as a description of a particular form of literature. And from literature it comes into more widely, broad-based use as a way of describing a philosophical shift, or a thinking, or a shift in the way that people think. And so you have a couple of observers here. Diogenes Allen, professor for many years at Princeton Theological Seminary, who wrote a book on the history of philosophy and theology, edited or did a second edition of that book to include a chapter on postmodernity. And Diogenes Allen describes postmodernity like this. He says, a massive intellectual revolution is taking place that is perhaps as great as that which marked off the modern world from the Middle Ages. So Diogenes Allen uses a very common kind of schema, if you will, that history, or at least recorded history, can be divided into three epochs. The so-called pre-modern, which would be the time, everything before the Enlightenment. The modern period, roughly the period of the Enlightenment, post-Enlightenment. The Enlightenment, again, in late 17th century, where there is an emphasis on the place of the human being in contrast with the place of God in the universe. So that pre-modern, God or deities said to occupy the center of things, and with the Enlightenment, the emergence of man and the capacity of man, particularly the capability of human reason. Okay? That characterizes the modern period. And Allen says that even as the Enlightenment kind of separated the modern world from what we call the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages, So postmodernity represents another shift. And the shift of postmodernity, he says, is as great as this shift from the pre-modern to the modern. Another scholar, Thomas Oden, is even more exact. He again uses kind of the three epoch schema of modern or pre-modern, modern, and postmodern. And he says that modernity lasted precisely 200 years. He dates the beginning of modernity with 1789, French Revolution, storming of the Bastille, and the end of modernity, 1989, with the fall of the Berlin Wall. And so he sees postmodernity as a relatively recent phenomenon. Most scholars who study this argue that postmodernity is a phenomenon that begins to develop after the Second World War, particularly in the 1950s, 1960s. So there's some debate as to exactly how we kind of historically map the beginning of postmodernity. But that need not really delay or concern us that much here. We want to talk about the characteristics of postmodernity. What, kind of what fuels people's thinking today, particularly in the area of ethics.
Before you advance,
Yeah.
I'm not familiar with enlightenment.
Okay.
Expound on that a little bit more.
Enlightenment, the term enlightenment was used as a way of kind of contrasting this new period of thinking that came after the Renaissance. So you think of Reformation, Renaissance, basically 16th, early 17th century. The Enlightenment comes in the latter part, for the most, really, of 17th century. So Middle Ages were often characterized as the Dark Ages. Why were the Middle Ages seen to be the Dark Ages?
Cultural war.
Well,
Fine arts and things.
what's that?
Fine arts and things.
Don't know anything about them.
Yeah, Dark Age, well, it was seen as a time of superstition. Lack of, and that rather than living life based on empirical knowledge, something that you can measure, something that you can touch, something that you can say, this is it. The Middle Ages, the Dark Ages were seen as the age of faith. Yeah? And faith was often correlated with superstition. Not only a belief in God, but a belief in witches and goblins and demons, things that go bump in the night. And so man is basically self-enclosed. He's living in this kind of existence that is determined by fear. And a recognition of, of a power beyond himself to which he has to be obedient. And the custodian of this obedience is the church, Roman Church. And so there are, the whole episode with Galileo and Copernicus, for example. That the church is seen as restricting experimentation and knowledge. And that the Enlightenment comes and the university is actually freed from the church. You now have the language of kind of freedom for intellectual inquiry. We call it academic freedom. Scholars are not expected to submit their findings to the Roman Curia for approval. And and there was a reaction against anything that would restrict or suppress the human inquiry. And it was thought that the place of reason, and this is the big kind of thing for enlightenment, that human reason is independent. We're going to talk about autonomy a little later on. It's autonomous. You see this in the great philosopher Immanuel Kant, that human reason is independent, and that human reason can determine truth, and that human reason is capable of investigating sources, the past, and not necessarily believing that because something is written down or because something is assumed to be true, that it is true. So enlightenment had to do with this movement toward the exaltation of human reason.
Isn't it like the rise of science?
And the rise of science would be certainly part of that. The rise of science and the rise of historical investigation. With the Renaissance, the motto was ad fontes, back to the sources, so that you could take documents and you could investigate those documents and learn from those documents what the past actually was. And not all documents were to be seen as equal. So the whole question of establishing the integrity of a document. There were recognition that some documents were forged and so forth. Well, that's all part and parcel of the Enlightenment. Now, the period of modernity, still there is belief in absolute truth. I mean, after all, it's pretty hard to work the scientific method if there is not some understanding of absolute truth. Absolute truth, it was thought, could be obtained through investigation and experimentation. But it was still something that was excessive. And this is going to be one of the big shifts between modernity and post-modernity, where with post-modernity, the questioning of, is there any such thing as, we would say, absolute truth. One of the philosophers, a French philosopher, Jean-Francois Lyotard, and by the way, the French philosophers and literary scholars are really kind of at the forefront, or were at the forefront. Most of these men now have died. We're at the forefront philosophically of kind of charting the way for so-called post-modernity. And Lyotard says that one of the characteristics of post-modernity is incredulity toward a meta-narrative. Now, that's a kind of a sentence that's unusual, needs to be unpacked a little, but kind of bear with me here, but because it's important to understand. Meta-narrative. Meta with narrative story. All God's children got stories. You know? Recognition that to be a human being is not simply to be an isolated individual, but one who lives within a particular narrative. So if we would start a conversation, and usually it goes something like this, where are you from? What do you do? Do you have a family? Where did you go to school? What are all those questions getting at? Yeah. Okay. What's the story? What's your history? What's the story of your life? And so Lyotard says that to be a human being is to be part of a narrative. And these narratives, you can have a political narrative. you identify yourself as a socialist, or a Democrat, or a Republican, or a Libertarian, and you live within a particular political kind of narrative, and you make arguments for why that particular political persuasion is best. You have a religious narrative. You're Lutheran. You're Roman Catholic. You're Buddhist. Everybody is living within a narrative. And each narrative is constructive of its own meaning. And so, narratives include things like calendars. This past Sunday, we celebrated Trinity Sunday. You mentioned that to somebody outside the church. What's that? Is Trinity a new actor? What is it? Yeah. You have a narrative, and that narrative has particular meaning, but the meaning is said to be self-contained. And you really can't step outside of the narrative and make any kind of judgments about other narratives. Each story has its own structure of meaning. So what Leotard is getting at, he says the postmodern attitude is incredulity, suspicion, unbelief of a meta-narrative. A meta-narrative would be an overarching story that claims to explain and encompass all of reality. That's a claim that the Christian faith makes. Jesus' words, I am the way, the truth, the life. No one comes to the Father except by me. No other name given among men under heaven by which we are to be saved. And so Leotard is actually, in his own writing, is not so much addressing religious narrative as political narrative. And his point is, politically, that there is no one political system that will finally be kind of embracing of all reality, and that any political system that makes what we would call kind of totalitarian claims ought to be held under suspicion. But it is easily applied then to matters of religion and ethics. And so we move from France to a professor at the University of Virginia, who ended up, I think, at Stanford before dying a couple of years ago, Richard Rorty. And Richard Rorty gives a kind of an example here of this assertion that meaning, morality, truth have no objective existence, or to use the words of another American postmodern thinker from the University of Chicago, Stanley Fish, preferences are principles. Preferences are principles. Let's come back to that in a couple of minutes, because I think we see that enacted a lot today. But Richard Rorty is kind of an example. He tells this interesting story. He says, if a homeless orphan would show up at my doorstep, I would take that child in, provide shelter, protection, clothing. But it has absolutely no intrinsic meaning. In fact, Richard Rorty defines himself as a freeloading atheist. Well, what the heck is a freeloading atheist? Well, the way Richard Rorty puts it is that everybody has to live within a narrative. The ethical narrative that I live within is the Judeo-Christian, Western, democratic narrative, he says. And in that narrative, it is expected that human beings show generosity and kindness to each other. To get along as a human being, you have to be part of some narrative. You have to live with other human beings, and you can't simply do whatever you want. He is wise enough to recognize that. There's a need for law, there's a need for order, there's a need for an ethic. And he says, I'm a free-loading atheist. I don't believe it's true, but this is the narrative with which in which I live. And so if this child would come in, I wouldn't throw the child, into the street, kill the child. I would take the child in, care for him, because this is our narrative. But it has you can't say that it's good in any essential way or intrinsic way. Just as if you would throw the child into the street, you can't say it's bad. And that, I think, puts it kind of most starkly. That principles or preferences now are principles. I'm choosing to live by this kind of narrative. Third characteristic here, all human institutions and relationships are seen as expressions of power. One of the things that you will note if you just listen to the language is the way that the vocabulary of power has increased. You look at literature from 30 years ago, 40 years ago, you will not see the language of empowerment. But notice how that language is all over the place today. Even in the church, certainly in educational institutions. That you have course descriptions. University of Minnesota, where I served before going to the seminary, the Department of Gay, Lesbian, Transsexual, Bisexual, whatever studies. To empower, gay, lesbian, bisexual, transsexual people to do thus, or think thus, or obtain something. The language of empowerment. Because the argument is made that human institutions and relationships are, by their very nature, grabbing for power. Grabbing for power. And when some gain power, others are disempowered. And then kind of a liberationist motif. How do you give power, or how do those, I shouldn't put it like this, power is not something to be given, but how do the dispossessed claim and assert power for themselves? And so there is a particular kind of suspicion with postmodernism that tends to see everything in terms of either maintaining power or an attempt to kind of claim some power for oneself or one's community. Point that I think we'll be coming back to a bit. And then the fourth point here, with postmodernity, reason is rejected in the favor of emotion. That the Enlightenment project, which was the exaltation of reason, actually failed. That human rationality is not the answer. And this is something that I think is seen already. Well, it's seen in a variety of ways. It was even seen during the Enlightenment by a particularly odd but interesting Lutheran layman, a philosopher by the name of Johann Georg Hamann. who was actually a contemporary of Immanuel Kant. And not many people know much about Hamann, but Hamann already began to kind of question the ascendancy of reason and the way that reason was being made into de facto false God. Okay? But what happens in the 20th century? In the 20th century, the advent of this new century was received with a lot of excitement, because the 20th century was going to be the century in which war will be no more. The 20th century was going to be the Christian century. In fact, there's a journal that's still in existence today called the Christian Century. It was founded in 1900, and it argued that in the 20th century, the various denominations of Christendom would be united into a single church, and that the Great Commission would be fulfilled, and that the world would be Christianized, and there would be no more poverty, no more war, that we were evolving out of these things, okay? And then comes World War I and World War II, and reason was unable to deliver on the promises. The promise of the 19th century coming into the 20th century was that man had evolved to the point that he could actually use reason to create a better world. Spiritually, economically, politically, socially. Didn't happen. And so there is now, with postmodernity, a great suspicion of reason. But into this vacuum where reason is rejected comes emotion. And here I think if you simply listen to the way we talk, you see something of this. It's most common for Americans today not to say, I think, or I'm convinced, or I believe, but I feel, or I prefer. And so we have the language again of preference and the language of like. It's emotionally, in many ways, driven. Alistair McIntyre, Roman Catholic ethicist and philosopher at University of Notre Dame, calls this the ethic of emotivism. In other words, the way you win an argument is to simply shout louder, make a more emotional appeal. You know, the story about the old Baptist preacher, janitor's in the church on Monday morning, and he goes into the pulpit, and this Baptist preacher has his manuscript, and he's etched or sketched in or written in the side of the manuscript, argument weak, shout louder. In other words, if you can't make a reasoned argument, if reason is suspect, simply be more emotional about it, you know? Tell the heart-wrenching stories. That will, that will send to persuade. And so that reason rejected in the favor of emotion. Now, because there are so many different narratives, we have the phenomena of pluralism. If there is no meta-narrative, but many narratives, how do these various narratives live together? And the postmodernist argument is that pluralism necessitates an ethic of tolerance. So, if there cannot be kind of uniform agreement, we simply are said to tolerate other opinions. Of course, one of the problems with tolerance is that tolerance becomes very intolerant. Tolerance becomes something that is seen then to be enforced. And so those who are sometimes the most vocal champions of tolerance become the most intolerant. I have kind of a story that illustrates this from my time as campus pastor at the University of Minnesota. We had about 240 different religious organizations doing work at the University of Minnesota, and it was across the board. Everything from mainline denominational campus ministries to para-church groups like InterVarsity and Campus Crusade, all kinds of kind of local, homegrown para-church groups. We even had Wicca. We had Children of the Night, the University Pagan Association. We had the Buddhist Minnesota, University of Minnesota Buddhist Society, Hindu Society, Islamic Society, and even subgroups there. So we had everything. And we would meet once a month to kind of discuss kind of religious life on campus, broadly defined. The purpose of this group was simply to allow people doing religious work at the University of Minnesota to have some kind of venue for approaching the university, which had increasingly tried to kind of separate itself from religious organization. That would be another long story of how that took place. But the group was so diverse we could not do anything of a theological nature together. It was simply a kind of a pragmatic thing, arrangement. We had two requirements for membership in the Council of Religious Advisors. One was that you be doing religious work, however you define that, on or around the university campus. You were relating, that was your context, university campus, doing religious work. Second characteristic is that you would be transparent in terms of your own identity. And this was really against some of the cultic groups that were out there, especially in the 1990s, that would say we're non-denominational Christian, but they were actually Moonies, or they were in Boston Church of Christ, that kind of thing. So you had to be clear on who you were. That was a big issue. Well, I was on the executive committee of the Council of Religious Advisors at the time, and one of the responsibilities of the executive committee was to process applications. And so Jews for Jesus applies. Well, what's Jews for Jesus? You probably have heard of it. It's a so-called messianic Jewish organization of Jews who confess Jesus to be the Messiah. And they do evangelistic work amongst other Jews. They were doing religious work on campus. They were clear about their own identity. They applied for membership. So the executive committee would screen the application, and most likely, and under most circumstances, it was pretty pro forma. We would simply take the application to this monthly meeting of the council, and they would say, okay, we accept it. Well, when we brought the application for Jews for Jesus, the rabbi at the Hillel House became very agitated and stood up and said, if you admit them, I will leave. I find this offensive. They would be allowed to be part of this organization. And almost immediately, the ELCA campus minister said, in solidarity with my Jewish brother, we too protest. We will leave if they are admitted. And on down the line, the Episcopalians, United Church, Roman Catholic, campus priest. And so we had this dilemma. Now, what was interesting about this is that these people who were threatening to leave were the very people at previous meetings who had advocated openness, inclusivity, and religious diversity. Well, here's a group that is obviously diverse. And so the way it ended up is that the executive committee, which at the time consisted of myself, a Missouri Synod Lutheran, a Wisconsin Synod campus pastor, intervarsity kind of guy, and an Antiochian Orthodox priest, we were the ones arguing for a more tolerant, open, approach that Jews for Jesus ought to be allowed, not because any of us believed every tenet of Jews for Jesus, but because they met the criteria of the organization. So a vote was taken, and the assembly voted to accept Jews for Jesus, and these other groups walked out. And so we had this anomaly then of Council of Religious Advisors basically without the mainline denominational groups. So you had conservative groups like Wisconsin Missouri Synod, you had InterVarsity, you had Campus Crusade, you had Wicca, Society, and Jews for Jesus, you know. But the point that this illustrates is that those who claim to be most inclusive and most tolerant often are most totalitarian, intolerant. And I think we see that. We see that a lot today. And we need to be prepared, I think, to address that. Well, to move on, that's just pictures of some of the people I was talking about. Leotard, Fish, sorority. How then do we diagnose postmodernism? As I said, it's somewhat hard to define postmodernity. We also would, or I would also argue that the boundaries are not that clear. That I don't think Diogenes Allen and Thomas Oden are able to erect the kind of airtight borders between modernity and postmodernity that they seem to imply. Oswald Bayer, a German Lutheran theologian, puts it like this: many of our contemporaries, therefore, still live bodily in modernity, but intellectually and psychologically in postmodernity. In other words, what does he mean by that? He means that when the postmodern person comes into this room and flips on a light switch, he knows that the light switch is not going to do its thing because he wants it to do its thing, or because he prefers that there would be light here, but because there is a scientific principle at work. He might not understand electrical circuits, but he has the confidence that an electrician will wire this building in such a way that turning on that switch is going to cause light. And that bodily, Bayer says, we still very much live in the world of modernity. You go to a surgeon, and you really don't care, about whether the surgeon, emotionally believes that you can get better. You want to know something about his credentials and the procedures that he's going to use. So Bayer's point is that we have kind of this, we're living in kind of a mixed zone here. That bodily, we see people living in a world that is determined by modernity, but psychologically, intellectually, he says, spiritually, they live in the world of postmodernity. I mean, you think about this in matters of religion. A person who says all religions are the same. They don't believe that, by the way. Nobody really believes that. But you have people saying that. I mean, if you run into somebody who says, I believe all religions are the same, ask them about the religion of Moloch. And you might have to explain, Moloch was the god in the Old Testament that required child sacrifice. Are you really saying that being a Molochian is no different than being a Methodist? Typically, they're not willing to say that, But person who says, well, it doesn't matter what church you go to, you ought to just be going somewhere. They won't apply that when it comes to medicine. It doesn't matter what doctor you go to. You can go to a physician who was trained at the medical school at the University of Chicago, or you can go to somebody who was trained in voodoo medicine in the bayous of southern Louisiana. Doesn't matter. It's all the same. No, they don't believe that. They don't believe that. Bodily, they still believe that knowledge, capacity, skills, content have some intrinsic meaning. But when it comes to the spiritual, you see, they shift. They shift gears. And that's what Meyer means, I think, when he says that you have people who are bodily living in modernity, but spiritually, intellectually living in postmodernity. They don't see the contradiction. Or another contemporary